Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter Swoboda, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome back, everybody. This is a very special 30th episode of Season 2, and I've got a super special guest with me today, which happens to be my wife. Now, the reason why I'm bringing her into this is because we essentially collaborate on everything. And so she's been a very, very, very special part of my program, Making Good Men Great. And I'm going to explain a little bit why she's part of that process, because I think that's important to sort of get a sense of where we are coming from. So Lauren was raised in the 1950s in a very traditional family, basically to marry and have children. But Lauren's thinking was informed and formed by the intellectual ferment of the 1960s and 70s. The expansion of her ideas about herself and the potential of her life was fundamentally driven by philosophy. The Times also challenged the nation's participation in the Vietnam War, apartheid in South Africa, and discrimination in all of its varying forms within the human community. So that's not just about gender, it's about racism and any forms of inequity. And it also included the philosophies that underpin the conservation movement and the animal rights movement. It was a very serious time of questioning, something that I think that we've sort of abandoned in the last few decades, and I think we need to really get back to. Lauren feels very lucky to have lived in a privileged nation at this particular point in time when women were no longer excluded from the conversation. This led Lauren to pursue a career in mental health, as well as consolidating her interest in philosophy at a university level, gaining a master's degree in organisational ethics and having an honours degree in history and philosophy. So, Lauren, let's pick up with that whole notion of gender, men and women, okay? So here we are, you and I are working together, which is one of the big issues that I'm trying to get across with men, is that we need to be better at cooperating. What do you see as being the sort of main points in that whole issue about masculinity, femininity, feminism? Because we don't have a masculinism, as I point out in the book, and especially that issue about equality. So what are your thoughts about that?
I think it's important to remember that our understanding of gender is socially constructed, that it's the meanings and ideas we've given to the two biological sexes, that men should be a certain way and women should be a certain way based on their sex. And it is constructed within the patriarchal ideal in just about all nations throughout history. And this is a very important thing to remember when you're thinking about gender and what you expect of each other, of the other sex and of yourself, that it is not intrinsic. It is something that we have chosen to continue to think about as in the same way that has been thought about for millennia. And it hasn't worked well for either sex.
So let me play devil's advocate, because I get trolled a fair bit. And, one of the things that I get accused of is trying to turn men into women, into pussies. How would you respond to that?
That's based on very stereotypical ideas about what a man is and what a woman is. those ideas have already been challenged significantly over the last 60, 70 years. And the project for challenging those ideas has been in place for quite a few centuries. However, the strength of those stereotypes, I think, is what drives those ideas. Human beings are always afraid to change. It is not an easy thing to do. And a lot of people have very little understanding of their capacity or the opportunity that they may have to change. A lot of people actually go against their own best interests by not changing.
Well, it's interesting because, the podcast is called, Inspire Change. And so, in essence, you've seen an enormous amount of change. I mean, you came out of a traditional family, right, that expected you essentially, basically, to marry and have children. There wasn't really a powerful emphasis on gaining a career. And so that process across time through the 60s and 70s took you into a very different direction. One that was obviously for you a lot more fulfilling. And, not that, raising children wasn't fulfilling. I mean, you and I have been together for 40 years. We've got, 2 adult children who now have children of their own. And, we are absolutely over the moon with how they've grown as human beings. So, in that is in essence what I'd like to think that process of working together, cooperation and equity. So you yourself have seen a lot of change. Now, would you agree that in the last 2 to 3 decades, some of the progress that was made with regard to gender and equity between men and women is being eroded?
I think the project stalled. So if you think about the 1960s and 70s, it was challenging stereotypes, it was challenging old ideas, and the context of gender and the context of the opportunities for choices about our lives as men and women. Those concepts were being challenged. And if you think about how it slid into this place where the choice turned out to be that women became more like men, that women joined men in the workplace rather than that the workplace changed to embrace men and women doing things differently. Equality became sameness. Now, that's been challenged in the academic world, but in the real world of people's lives, there's very much an idea that somehow equality means sameness, and that difference is still a suspect thing unless it is located within stereotypes that are approved of by society.
Which happens to be patriarchy.
A patriarchal society, and those stereotypes are still quite locked into that very patriarchal, dualistic, divisive idea that men are this way and women are that way, and that there's no crossover, and that each of us have tasks and responsibilities that are different, and that there's no crossover.
So one of the big changes that we've seen historically, and you and I have been very much aware of that, is that the progressive participation of women within the workforce, and especially at higher levels, right? Now, there is in some areas still very much a glass ceiling, right? Now, my expectation initially during the early 80s when I started to see that process happening was that there would be a contribution of women that would not deconstruct patriarchy, but in essence, as the first step, soften it. So women would bring something to the workplace that men weren't bringing to the workplace, which was that men were, focused on being acquisitional, competitive, hierarchical, very territorial, right? But would you agree that that actually hasn't taken place, that contribution of the more female, women's feminine side into the workplace?
I think that the workplace, the world of work, is an extraordinarily patriarchal institution, and the strength of the structure in those institutions is such that it's very hard for anyone, male or female, to make changes that would look at work in a different way. There's also the problem that our values around the tasks of life didn't change. So women joined men in the workforce, but they still were expected to run the household, raise the children, and complete all the domestic tasks, which are still completely unvalued in our society. They are some sort of add-on instead of being recognised as something every human has to do. Every human has to have a clean house and wash their clothes and have food to eat and shop for it. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation because, I mean, my work is essentially with men, and quite often some of the men's attitude towards what she does at home is like, but that's not work, I'll swap any day. Now, I also know that some of the men, particularly during the COVID pandemic, have spent a lot of time at home now, and they're starting to change their tune. They're starting to go, hang on a minute, spending all day with the kids, trying to do the shopping, cleaning the house, getting the washing on my own, is actually tiring. And it's a bit of a stretch. So in that regard, I can see some positives about this very bad thing that's happened in the last 6 months, is that some men are starting to open up a little bit. Do you think that that's going to get more traction?
It's hard to say. I think that this is an opportunity for people who have not had the experience of looking at life in a much more open and less stereotypical way, have had to rethink their attitudes. But it's about value. Do we value raising our children as much as we value making a living?
Well,
Why?
Sorry to interrupt. Let me interrupt there. It's not just making a living. It's actually making a financial killing. Like, this is one of the things that's imposed on men often. Our measure of success is usually identified in monetary terms. So the more money you make, the more successful you're seen, the better you're positioned in society. Now, if a lot of men take up what's been recognised as women's work in many respects, they're devalued. Primary school teaching. Most men actually can't afford to be a primary school teacher, even if they wanted to be, because it's not paid enough. Would you agree with that? That we need to change that whole...
It's a massive, massive social need for us to rethink how we value the tasks of our lives. Because making a living, whether we make a killing or whether we are paid only an adequate amount of money for our work, is irrelevant. It's about which part of our lives we value. And up until fairly recently, everything men did was valued and everything women did wasn't. Now, I have no doubt that 99.9% of men love their children dearly. Why do they not value the tasks that are necessary to raise them to be happy human beings? Because they have been told that's not their job.
Yes, exactly. So we have this issue about territory. So there's territory for men and there's territory for women. And under this current sort of, circumstances of the pandemic, I think that idea is really being challenged. Well, I'd like to think optimistically, although, some of that's been curtailed a little bit over the last 3 decades, that this could be the thing that could take us a bit further. I mean, I've talked about in Making Good Men Great that part of the conversation is about deconstructing patriarchy. It's not just making men more in touch with their feelings. It's actually getting men to start critically thinking about these issues and how it's not an either or, but an and also. Nurses were going for a salary increase, and that's been put on hold, at the very time that they're an essential part of, the solution to dealing with this massive health problem.
Well, I think that this is a fascinating sort of part of what's going on at the moment, is that you said that men's value is based on them making a financial killing, and yet the essential people in our society who have had to continue to work while all those men who make a killing financially had to go home were the people who are paid very little. So, the people who keep things running, who are totally essential to our well-being as a society, are not the people who are normally valued by our institutions and by the patriarchal ideal behind them.
Yeah. I remember in the 80s there was a garbageman strike, and, I happened to be running a training course for executives at the time, and they were absolutely livid about how dare these people go on strike. We should just sack the lot, bring in the army. They're not necessary, they're uneducated, they're, blue-collar workers. And this was a leadership program, and, by the end of the first week, I sort of said, so who's essential here? Executives or the garbage men? And they all had to agree, well, it's getting to be a bit ridiculous, because if this continues for 3, 4, 5 weeks, there's going to be diseases out there. And I said, that's absolutely the point. It's not that one is more important than the other. It's about being in this together, that each person has a place in the scheme of how a society operates. And I think would you agree that that's a point that's often missing?
That is a glaring point that is always missed in our societies of today, that has been fermenting for centuries, this idea that the people who grow our food, who dig the ground, who take away the rubbish, who look after us and care for us in hospitals, or who serve us in shops, are not as good or as important as someone who sits in an office and works with paper or nowadays computers.
So it comes back to that idea that you put forward that I think is really critical, and that is that sameness doesn't mean equality.
That's right.
Okay, so let's take that a little bit further. Okay, so we accept that we're not the same. We can be different. Okay, and in our differences, we can work together. It becomes an inclusive thing. It's one of the things that we talk about in Making Good Men Great. One of the fundamental values is inclusivity. All right. At the moment, I see lots, especially women, lots of women who go, I'm not a feminist. What's your response to that?
I think there's some rather complex issues behind this. Firstly, there is the issue of feminism itself as an idea. A lot of people have forgotten that the essential idea in feminism is about equality. It is about the fact that women and men are of equal worth and value, just as black and white people are of equal worth and value, just as people who believe in different religions or different ways of being in the world are equal in value. Then there is the issue that academically feminism has been divided up into interest groups and subsets. Factions. And that this has confused people. Then, of course, there is the legitimate issue of a lot of women emerged through the feminist movement of the 70s and the second wave of feminism with a lot of anger and resentment. And whether we like it or not, we need to acknowledge that a lot of women have been very seriously harmed by a lot of men because of the power relationships that we had in the past. And sometimes that anger leaked out. And so there's a lot of people who are frightened of being seen as men haters.
See, when you say that, one of the things that comes to my mind now is not just gender, but also about race.
Oh, yes.
The idea of, that's being challenged a lot, of all, Black Lives Matter, the comeback often by people is, well, all lives matter, right? And in the gender space, one of the things that I often find extraordinarily irritating, and I struggle to see how you could actually sort of equate that, is when women talk about, being harmed by men, the response is that, well, women harm men as well. Right? So there's this reactionary force constantly going, and it doesn't matter whether it's in gender or whether it's in race at the moment. So, how do you see that from your perspective? I mean, you've had experiences that I as a male would never have. I don't feel unsafe at 9 o'clock in a car park when there's no one else around. I don't necessarily, if there's 5 bikies there, I might get a bit antsy. But being on my own, and I know you've had that experience, and I suspect most women have had that experience where they feel unsafe in a particular environment.
I think that there's very few women on this planet who haven't felt unsafe just walking down the street. The reality is that is an artefact of a patriarchal ideal that divided us as human beings and that created power relationships where one sex was given power over the other sex.
And that applies to white and black.
It applies throughout all human societies.
Yeah.
It's just that there's subsets of that application through racism and other divisional ways of looking and discriminatory ways of looking at human beings. This failure to recognise that human beings are all the same and irrespective of their biological sex or their colour or their religion or the culture that they've arisen in. But all of those cultures divided their people up into these subsets of male and female, then the hierarchies that had the lower class or slave and the middle class or the upper class, and the power relationships are the important factor here because you give some people power over other people, and the people who are disempowered are going to be fearful. And in the gender relationships that we've had up until now and still in place in many places around the world, women have naturally been fearful because they have been completely disempowered. And so I think one of the reasons why you get that reaction of me too, it's not just women who are harmed, men are too, is that those men are feeling that their power is being eroded, and it's frightening. It causes anxiety.
Yeah. And whenever I see men get anxious, they have a tendency to get aggressive. And some of that aggression will lead to violence. And so I think that's a really, really important psychological point. So if I go, from philosophy to psychology to sociology, there's a direct connection. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
So from that point onwards, we need to be able to interrelate those ideas in understanding, not just philosophical ideas, but how that impacts on human beings psychologically, and then to us as a group, right? So if I look at the current media, then in many respects, geopolitically, for example, if we talk about politics as an extension of sociology, we're not doing well. We're seeing polarisation, right? So, in the 60s and 70s, certainly I think you and I felt that there was a narrowing of the differences where we were going to come together. But by the end of the 80s, especially with the introduction of economic rationalism and the movement towards polarising access to wealth, right? So we were shrinking the middle class. The working class is becoming more and more disenfranchised and disengaged from the democratic process, in a sense, which is about equality, right? We've got a far more volatile situation on our hands at the moment. Would you agree with that?
We're going backwards. It's a major problem that the ideals that became more spoken about, more part of the conversation in the ordinary world outside of academic institutions through the 60s and 70s, seems to have been moved back into those academic institutions, and ordinary people having changed some areas of our lives through legal and societal processes whereby legally everybody is equal. Legally, the garbage man and the executive and CEO are considered to be of equal worth. And yet, in practice, in reality, that is not how it works in our society. So what we've done is we've put in place some of the processes we needed to raise ourselves out of that old hierarchical, divisive, almost class-based approach to society. But in practice, things have not changed that much.
Yeah, I mean, if I think about, for example, the United States or the UK and even Australia, if I'm black, I don't get the same legal process necessarily as I do as a white person. Right, so people rally against that idea about white privilege. They forget that's a real thing that is not imagined. There's in the United States there's a case at the moment where someone stole something very minor. It was just a small thing, but they're in jail for life. A black man. We also have the situation where a young white man rapes a white woman, but it's her fault, not his. He's let off. Why? Because he comes from a very highly privileged family that's very, very, very wealthy. Now, my thinking is that at some point some of these issues are no longer sustainable. Do you think we're getting to that point where people are basically getting, and I'll be blunt, jack of this shit, right, and going, we need to really get into the system and change it?
I think we're at a very interesting tipping point in Western society where we have to make some better choices or we are going to find ourselves in serious trouble. I think that the idea that you can ignore the very real divisions and the very real discrimination that occurs within our society and just forge ahead, focusing on much more shallow and superficial ideas like how much money we're making, has been something that has created a massive problem for our society. The idealisation of the economy above society has left us in a position where we've lost our sense of community. It's not as bad here in Australia, but it's so very obvious in America.
And
right now,
UK,
and the UK. But, right now, in the midst of this pandemic, when we are being asked to look after each other, there are mass protests about people claiming that it's their right to behave in a way that is going to cause harm to others.
Yep.
A failure to understand rights and what that philosophically means has caused people to think of their rights in a very individualistic and very narrow way. And they don't understand that there are levels in rights, that there's a hierarchy in rights, actually, that your right not to wear a mask does not trump someone else's right not to die. That, you don't have rights out of the ether. They don't exist separately from what we give to each other, and we do that as a community, and we've lost that sense of community. And if we were less divided, if we were less pulled apart by stereotypical ideas about how we should be, if we were able to all be more in touch with what works in our lives to make all of us happy, then our community would be stronger and we wouldn't have this sort of division and sort of unhappiness and disempowerment that we have amongst people now.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about rights, I mean, my brain always goes in, well, with rights comes responsibilities, which is the social glue. The two together is a social glue. And, one of the things that requires in many respects is the capacity to empathise with others. Now, there's been quite a number of pieces of research since the mid-80s that show that there's been a steady and progressive decline of empathy in the community. And it's predominantly, the research has been done in the UK, Australia, in the United States, especially in the United States. Now, in the work that you and I discussed when I was putting together Making Good Men Great, one of the issues that I brought up was that patriarchy is an ideology which directly influences the psychology of the male, part of which is lowering the capacity to empathise. Now, I always, for a long time, thought that almost essentially applied to a lot of men, but the discovery, both in my clinical work, but also observing the community and doing a lot of reading, women are doing the same thing. There's a great deal of reduced empathy amongst women, not just for, say, for example, men, but also for each other. Do you think that there's a direct correlation with being or trying to stay in that place of fitting into the patriarchy rather than challenging it? Like women in the workforce, when you look at most of the mentoring programs and, how to succeed as a woman in business, a lot of them are basically, let's train you to be a male.
That's right. That is where we lost our way. In the 80s, with the power suit and the great big shoulders and women becoming androgynous and this whole refusal to accept equality as being part of human life irrespective of difference, the whole idea of equality as sameness propelled this idea that, especially within the world of work and the world of politics and that outside of the home world, that women would become more like men. I find it interesting that men are afraid that we're wanting them to be more like women because it's women who have made all the change, and it hasn't been good for any of us because as they have moved into this process of accepting the ideals of maleness as being the norm, then those ideals that don't work well for any of us, like the acquisitional and territorial ideas especially have made our society extraordinarily consumerist and materialistic. And that has infiltrated through into our relationships. So our relationships have become instrumental, and they are also acquisitional and hierarchical, and attitudes within relationships have become exploitative, and that has completely undermined empathy. And it's not just men, it's men and women.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you're talking about this materialism that's emerged. I mean, one of the strongest shifts that I've seen in the religious communities is, for example, prosperity theology. It's a form of Christianity that is fundamentally based on, if you believe in God, God will give you what it is that you want in a material sense, like you'll have lots of money and all that sort of thing. And I often sort of, if I stay in that theological thinking, go, where the hell did that come from? That is just completely antithetical. And we could have theological discussions about Jesus and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that, if I look at groups like the Quakers, for example, in the early Reformation that took place in Transylvania, that was there were communities that were really trying to function on a much, much more equitable level. And somehow that stuff always gets lost. Like, right now, we really are struggling to get that sense of equality back off the ground and empathy. I was absolutely stunned when I looked at the news and that the sort of, protests in places like Germany against, dealing responsibly with COVID. We don't want to wear a mask. We don't want to take care of each other. So there's this, it's all about me, this, intrinsic selfishness. Now, I talk about it in patriarchal thinking that's actually a form of acquiring narcissism, i.e., in patriarchal thinking, I am better than the other, right? And that gives me certain levels of privileges, entitlements, and also a way of dominating and controlling. And it's not just towards women, it's towards anybody that I see as different. Hence I come back to that issue of wealth discrimination, but also racial discrimination, religious discrimination, and also a lack of sense of stewardship. Like, we don't take care of the environment, right? The ecology is sort of seen as something that's, there to be exploited. What do you see that we need to move out of that space? There's questions about leadership here, and one of the things that I find really, really scary is at this particular point in time, what we've got is we've been usurped by the strong men. Now, some of them are stupid, and I'm not going to name any names, but they're blatantly obvious. But some of them are extraordinarily cunning, and they play on this notion of difference constantly, whether it's ethnicity, the sort of nationalistic, patriotistic stuff, is being driven down people's throats. Now, at some point, I think that if we let that run, we're going to get to an extinction point. Our planet is going to be doomed. We're going to be doomed. It's possible. And lots of people are arguing that currently America is at the brink of potentially civil war and civil unrest. So from your point of view, right, and you've done a lot of reading in this, what do you reckon we need to get out of this funk? What do you need? What sort of leadership?
We need younger people to move into leadership positions. We need the people whose futures are really at risk to step up. What we have at the moment is a retreat back into the patriarchy of the past. It's much more complex than just taking us back to the way it was 100 years ago. What the institutionalized patriarchal control of humanity has done, basically, is it's incorporated some of the new ideas that have been battering away at the edge of it for the last 50 years, but it's subsumed those into itself. And if you look at the way the last 40, 50 years have gone in terms of the financial inequality, the underpinning of democracy is the middle class, where the majority of people actually have enough to be comfortable enough financially and materially that they are able to pursue education, to be able to think, to have an interest in the politics of the community around them, and to participate. However, as you narrow that middle class and you reduce the capacity of people to do anything but just survive, and you narrow the more financially affluent and successful class to the group who have all the power, then we're going back to the place that we always used to be in, where a very few controlled all of the resources and had all of the power, and everyone else just did what they were told. And that is where we're moving, unless we have people decide that they are going to stop it. Now, it's not going to be 80-year-old white men putting their hands up to be the President of the United States who is going to make this change. It's going to be people in their 30s and 40s who are going to stand up and go, just wait there, I want my children to have a good future, and that's at risk.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that I tend to see is that, ageism actually has disenfranchised a lot of people. We need the wisdom of the elderly, but we don't need the dinosaur. And one of the things that I'm very conscious is that, if we're going to change this, we need to get people to open up to have meaningful conversations about lots of different levels, not just academically, not just at the executive and leadership level, where the corporate leadership comes together with the political leadership. It's a trickle down and a trickle up of conversation that is meaningful about what is it that makes us as a society really work well together. The problem is, at the moment, everything's based on, at that level, on wealth. I mean, if you want to get into a meaningful conversation politically, you need to have money. It's all about donations. It's about lobby groups. And so if we talk about what's needed to change this, then we're really talking about a new form of activism that we saw in the 60s, but in a different shape.
What we need to do is completely rethink what we value. At the moment, the materialist, consumerist, shallow attitudes of our society about what is valuable are destroying us. We're destroying the planet. This pandemic is a direct result of the way we have neglected the planet, the way we've intruded all over the planet into areas of the environment and ecology with, no forethought to what lives there already and how the systems work in terms of the planetary systems, the natural systems of the planet. This pandemic is a result of this. It's a result of us pushing to acquire more and more stuff. And we've failed to see that in the end, we're going to be lost in the stuff. but we're, and we may not actually be able to claw our way out of it. And it is a major problem that people still not listening to those few voices that are out there trying to get us to hear them, that we need to make some fundamental changes about what we value. And that comes back to the whole of our lives and what we value. It comes back to the valuing of the tasks of our lives, the valuing of the people in our lives. What is more important, owning a brand new car or providing your child with a decent education?
And enough time with the parent.
Well, that's right, because an education comes from the parent. Children do not flourish without their parents.
Oh.
One of the major problems we have seen over the last 40 or 50 years in the Western world is that the idea that children can be abandoned, so that everybody goes off to work in the world of work of men, has left children in a place where we're seeing them as being really not happy. A lot of our children are struggling.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I work with teenage boys and I see that on a daily basis. But it's reflected right throughout. But those sort of, and again, I come back to that relationship between philosophy, the ideas of how we think we need to be as a community and how that affects us psychologically. If I take that as a metric, right now we're in a terrible space. I mean, the suicide rate amongst men, for example, is just skyrocketing, and it's right through teenagers onwards. There's a whole bunch, and there's many discussions that we can have around that. But when I was working, for example, in the public service, one of the things that we were talking about is, does productivity simply rest on the amount of work that you do, or is it part of a scheme wherein we look at the well-being of the workforce? Things like job satisfaction, things like morale, things like workload, workflow, all of those things. And it got a little bit too hard for everybody, and they abandoned that. And, I was strongly trying to push that in the organisation that I was at, but I was getting so much pushback on that it wasn't funny, and basically told, don't go there. Do you reckon we should be doing that same stuff with the nation? Because all our stuff that we hear from our politicians is constantly about the economy. No one goes, are people actually happy in this? And when they talk about the economy, what they're doing is they're talking about the top end, the 1 to 5%. How well is BHP doing? How well is Apple doing? How well is the stock market doing? The stock market has virtually no relevance to you or I and our state of well-being, either financially or otherwise, physically or psychologically or socially. Right? So if we're talking about changes, we've got the changes at an individual level, situations, circumstances, and the system as a whole. If we go along the way of thinking through this, if we look at ideology as a form of philosophy, we need to deconstruct these ideologies completely. Do you reckon that should be done at a community level, or should it just be the work of the corporate leaders, the politicians, the academics? What do you think?
One of the major problems we have at the moment is our concept of government. Because over the last 50-odd years, we have built this vision that government should be run like a business. Now, this is a direct result of the Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan period of economic...
Chuck in Alan Greenspan,
economic rationalism, the idea, and it was articulated at the time that the government should run like a small business. That is what Thatcher said. As she also said, there's no such thing as society. it's individuals out for themselves. Now, we are seeing right now the results of that sort of approach to government. Government is not a business. It is a totally different entity. A business is the prime drive and goal of a business is goods and services and to make a profit. That is not what a government is about. A government is about being the leadership of a community that distributes the goods of that community in a fair and equitable way amongst all the members of that community. So corporations have no place in government because they are completely opposite to what a government's about.
Now that's going to be a massive change. Lauren, we covered a lot of areas, so time's running out. I want to say thank you very much. I want to make sure that you and I are going to have this again. So, this little segment is going to be conversations with my wife, a current affair, and I'm hoping that you're going to come on deck again to have perhaps a little bit more of a pointed topical discussion. Like, we covered a lot of ground, right?
Oh, an enormous amount on a very superficial level.
Yeah. I'd like to drill down deeper. I mean, your training and experience in philosophy and in history, the arts, and so on, I think is a really valuable one. My skill set is fundamentally within the psychological realm, but I draw from philosophy and history and so on to flesh out. I don't think we can understand human beings and human behaviour and mental health in a way, for want of a better word, or mental illness either, without understanding the context. Philip Zimbardo was quite right. There's issues about, what's dispositional, what's situational, and what's systemic in social and individual behaviour. He talks about, the issue of evil. Why is it that good people can do evil things? And I think that question, I keep coming back to that issue at the moment about socially, we do need to ask ourselves, why is there stuff going on that if you look at it from all sorts of different perspectives, the real conclusion is that this stuff's evil. The types of political, military, social issues that are going on. If you were a religious person, you'd go, well, the devil's at work here. But it's not the devil, it's human beings. So I'd like further conversations together to go a little bit more specific. You on board?
Yep.
All right. Let's do it. So I'd just like to thank Lauren again for a really interesting discussion. As we talked about, this went really broad, a little bit of stuff a bit more specifically, but we're going to drill down a little bit deeper time and time again. And remember, from time to time, there's going to be 1 hour, either streamed or recorded, conversations with others who I see as thought leaders and who have a broader level of consciousness in mind than simply what we've been given through the media. And I think the media is a real serious issue in this. So I hope that has given you some idea into myself, my partner in life, where we're coming from, what it is that we think is meaningful, what it is that, we need to start doing. Otherwise, it's not looking good. And, inspiration for change is towards something better, both individually, within the family, but also within the community. And we have the power and the opportunity to really pull that together. But we've got to have the courage to start acting outside of the box, the script that we've been given. So yes, making good men great is about deconstructing patriarchy. Why? Because that'll open up conversations for those who've been kept out of the conversation. It's about really starting to become a lot more self-aware, but also culturally more aware, so that we can become more flexible and more adaptable to a world that's rapidly changing constantly at the moment, technologically and in many other ways. We are at a critical historical time. And, just putting a point to that, I was just reading that the discrepancy in wealth right here and now is significantly greater than the discrepancy of wealth at the time of the French Revolution. So let that one sink in, because all it would take is one major flashpoint right now and it will all go to hell. And we don't want that. So until next time, thanks for listening.
Thank you, Gunter. And thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Again, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for a show, you can email development@noirtainment.com. That's development@noirtainment.com. Thank you, and thank you for listening.